Well, I acquired the document through the WGBH auction in 1978.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, and it was certainly before black memorabilia became
The rage and
popular
popular that it is today, yes.
Yes, but because it was a certificate of citizenship for a person of color, I personally felt it should belong to a person of color. So I got the high bid.
If I may ask, how much did you pay for this in 1978?
I paid $75, which at the time my mother thought was outrageous. It was well worth it.
In retrospect, it wasn't outrageous. I need to share a couple exciting things with you here. This is an important document that is showing George Barker, the gentleman right here, and he was born in 1788, and that he is a free person of color and a citizen of America. And more importantly, it's showing descriptive information about his height, He's 5'2". He has sable complexion and he has woolly hair.
Yes.
Is that just not indicative of the time periods where they were describing African Americans with woolly hair?
Exactly.
The other thing that's exciting is that down here we have where it says, for the relief and protection of American seamen not having made provision for persons of color to obtain certificates of citizenship.
Right.
This document is so important. You have a wonderful seal right here. It's archivally framed. It's from Massachusetts. I've never seen something like this. With the genre of Black memorabilia, we get to see so many types of documents that are attributed to slavery. We get to see Certificate of Freedom. We see manumission, writ of affidavit, bill of sales, court cases. But it's very unusual to see a document of this significance concerning a free person of color where it's all laid out in such exquisite form. We know his name, his height, his age, and the notary public. I mean, this document could not be more significant. Do you have any idea what it could be worth today?
Not a clue. Just, no
Let me
idea.
tell you, scholars, collectors, museums, libraries would eat this up. How about $3,500 to $5,000 for this document?
That's
Now, is your mom still living?
Yes, she is, and she's going to be mighty
Make
shocked.
sure you tell her that $75 many years ago was well spent.
It's amazing.
Thank you very much for sharing with the Antiques Roadshow.
Good morning, everybody. This is King Sigma, and we are live on this February 18th, 2020 morning. I appreciate you all joining me. I think that today's show, Free to Choose and Move, episode 2, The Lost Story of George Barker and Free Movement, will be very educational and informative to those that may have never heard of George Barker. So before I get started, I just wanted to shout out everyone in the chat. I saw Art Nusto TV over there. Peace to you, brother. Black Uhura Strikes, Sheila E, Turbattle, Solomon Giles, Mr. Pump and Dump. That dude got like the best name, Mr. Pump and Dump. He just, if that's not Mode 1, I don't know what is. Let me see, we got Rashawn Burr in here, DJ M, and Zero Max. And definitely a salute to anyone else that's happened to be viewing on this lunch break special. I wanted to do this live stream because there's been a lot of conversation about Black male free movement, Black male freedom of choice over the last 60 days. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. In fact, it's important that as we start this new decade, that we revisit history, that we regain an understanding of some of the lost stories of the millions and millions of Black men and the Black women that have come before us. Okay. And as we move further and further away from the Jim Crow apartheid era, a lot of these stories will get lost as Blacks become more disintegrated and become more assimilated and become more global. So if you do have a chance to tell a story that is lost, it's a good thing because most people do not know who George Barker was. And also, we are at the end of Black History Month, which was started by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And for those that don't know, Dr. Carter G. Woodson was a Harvard-educated and University of Chicago graduate. He was actually the second Native Black American after Dr. Webb Du Bois received his doctorate from Harvard to receive a doctorate. So I've always thought Dr. Carter G. Woodson was a fascinating person just looking at his resume, you know, having attended Harvard, having graduated from the University of Chicago, and he was doing all this in the first 2 decades of the 20th century with all the racial tension that was going on in America at the height of Jim Crow. And he's actually the father of Black History Month. But he has just a great story, you know, having been born in Virginia as a sharecropper son and having worked many odd jobs. He was mostly blue collar until he decided to attend high school late in the game. Like he attended high school in his early 20s. So his story is aspirational because it shows that, you know, at any moment, you can turn your life around and go in a different direction. If there's anyone that has a legacy, it's Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who also is known for writing the best-selling book, The Miseducation of the Negro. So this is a stream dedicated to those like Dr. Carter G. Woodson that it made it their life's work to make sure that the Native Black American side of the American story is told, because there's a lot of revisionist history going on in 2020 where they're taking our historical figures and using them for purposes that are vile and had nothing to really do with what they were doing when they were living. So a lot of people have attempted to hijack Native Black American historical figures because we Black Americans have not done a good enough job of protecting our cultural assets and our historical heroes. So for me, this is just an attempt to share a lost story of Native Black American history. So when we talk about this conversation related to freedom of movement, this is a very sensitive topic for any Black person, but it definitely for Black American men. And I say that because in terms of the social contract that has been in place in the United States, you have to look at the U.S. Constitution and the founding documents of this nation. And Black American men have been the most restricted of any group in United States history. No other group has been more restricted in their choice and in their movement than the Black American men. And the irony of it is the fact that the Native Black American man has made the most sacrifices of any group that's ever lived in in the United States of America, especially when you consider what little benefits that they've received in exchange for so many sacrifices while having a breach of that contractual relationship just on a daily basis for the last 280 years or whatever of the that specific contract. So we all know that the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, and that it was actually signed in 1787, but it was actually ratified by all the states in 1788. And since that day, you know, Black American men, we've been fighting for our right to be a part of this constitutional republic. And that's why individuals like myself, when I talk about things like the American Creed, the Constitution and Preamble, it's not something that's foreign. It's the only thing that I feel that's between myself and the rest of society. And I don't believe that there should be anyone that's more outspoken about the American Creed, you know, in relations to liberty, equality, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire economics. The Black man has earned a right to carry that flag. And when I see individuals saying that, no, you shouldn't be for liberty and equality and individualism and populist politics and laissez-faire economics, I have to give them the side eye. And I have to wonder what people like Dr. Carter G. Woodson would think, you know, hearing these kind of arguments. It's very embarrassing, to be honest with you at this point, that you would argue the American Creed as a Black man. And George Barker, the protagonist of this story, I just can't imagine what he would say considering the sacrifices that he made. He was a very interesting individual, and I'm gonna get into that. But so when we talk about the ideas in the Constitution, which is a contract between the governed and the governors, the preamble, no one should carry that flag more than the Native Black American man. And so the preamble of the U.S. Constitution reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." That's the contractual agreement between you and those that govern you. And no group in America has tried to bring life to those empty words for most of American history than the Native Black American man. And George Barker is one of those men. So that's really how I feel in my heart of hearts. No group has had and made more sacrifices and received fewer tangible policies and appreciation than the Native Black American man. He is constantly berated, disparaged, and disrespected because people do not understand how foundational he has been in playing a role in every war in America, all policies related to like justice and fighting back against a dominant society that was much more vicious over the course of American history. And at every stage, it was Black brave and courageous intelligent black men that fought against that stuff. You got to think, someone like a Carter G. Woodson at the peak of Jim Crow, coming out of a southern state, a Jim Crow state like Virginia, working his way up to DC and then to Chicago, and just having the kind of great life that he had, despite all of the roadblocks and obstacles that were put before men like that. And I think what happens when we get lost in these 2020 conversations, that we have a lot of disrespect for our history. We're very disingenuous, and it's very, cowardly to piss on the graves of men like that and women that also supported them. Because it's easy in 2020 to forget the kind of sacrifices that our great grandparents made for us. It's very easy to forget that as we move further and further away from the Jim Crow apartheid era. But I think that we should take a pause and have like a little bit more respect for those like George Barker and Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who they didn't have the advantages that we have. They were greater men than we have proven to be so far. Yes, I'm going to say it. Those like Dr. Carter G. Woodson, those like George Barker were greater men than we are today. Because we have so many advantages in this fourth industrial age that we're not taking advantage of. We didn't put in the kind of work that they put in. But yet we sit up here and we cast aspersion on their names and on their legacies every day in the most disrespectful way possible. I definitely think that we're one of the most disrespectful generations to ever live in the United States when you consider just so many sacrifices made by men like that, man. Most of us have never proven to be able to endure what they endured and what they were still able to accomplish. You can only imagine what someone like a Carter G. Woodson, a Dr. Du Bois would have been able to accomplish in this fourth industrial age with the kind of mentality that they had, the kind of fortitude that they had. One has to wonder what they would have accomplished. They would have built their own universities. They would lead all the universities with their intellect, with their grind. You see what I'm saying? So I would never disrespect those people's legacy. And I see that happening a lot here, especially when we're talking about this freedom of movement. The main people that have these conversations that are against freedom of movement and freedom of choice are the ones that have made the least amount of sacrifices for that. If the clock was turned back and you were transported back to that era, you wouldn't be saying these type of things at all. You would be crying to be returned back to 2020. So I just think that we should, be a little bit more careful and responsible in how we talk about these conversations, and that we do it intelligently, So, who is George Barker? As you saw in the intro clip in that Antique Roadshow, that was an authentic copy of what was called a certificate of U.S. citizenship back in the early 1800s. And it's one of the few that you can actually still find around. And the reason why George Barker is so important to freedom of movement, he's actually the forefather of Black American men getting passports. Yes. You weren't told that in high school. You weren't told that in your history books. But George Barker was actually, if not the first Black person to ever receive a passport, he was one of a handful of Black Americans at that time to receive a passport. And you notice that when they described him as a 5'2", dark-skinned, kinky-haired, woolly-haired Black man. Now, George Barker, he was born in 1788. And that's why it's so important that I give you that history of the U.S. Constitution, because he was actually born the year that the Constitution was ratified in a state that the year he was born abolished slavery. Ain't that something, right? That's something. So the year that George Barker was born in 1788, that same year, the U.S. Constitution was ratified, and the state that he was born into, Massachusetts, had just abolished slavery. Because see, what happened is that a lot of the northern states understood the hypocrisy of fighting a revolutionary war but not abolishing slavery in their states. So what happened is that over the course of what was called the Revolutionary Era, which was basically like the 1770s to like the late 1790s, many of those northern states abolished their slave trade that was internal to their states. And George Barker happened to be lucky enough to be born in the Boston area and was able to be born free. He was actually born a free man. So some of the states that abolished slavery during that time period was New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Ohio. and Indiana would be the next free state admitted. But that happened literally the same year that George Barker's passport was issued to him in 1815. So the slave states that were so when George Barker was 27, that's when he got his U.S. passport, and that U.S. passport was actually issued by the James Madison's presidential administration. He was the 4th president at that time. So that same year, the state of Indiana was applying for their statehood. Now, remember, there was quite a lot of discussion at that time about who would be admitted as a slave state, who would be admitted as a free state. The people of Indiana decided to admit Indiana as a free state. So that's good. But what happened is that because you had this split in the United States, where half of the countries at that time, there were 19 states the year that George Barker applied for his passport, half of the countries were slave states and the other half were freeborn states. So there had to be some kind of pass system for those free blacks at that time to move around. So certain state issued certain passes, but the federal government was having a lot of issues where free black people were being kidnapped, by southern states or whatever. And so they had to come up with a federal law and a federal policy. So James Madison and his Secretary of State at the time, who was actually James Monroe. Now, for those that know presidential history, they know that James Monroe actually ended up becoming the 5th president of the United States. So he succeeded James Madison. So here you had a dark-skinned, kinky-haired black man from Boston, Massachusetts, born free at a time when 90% of blacks were enslaved in the South. And here's a guy that had the kind of intelligence and worldly view that he was able to go from Massachusetts, make application through the State Department at the time. Now, we're not talking about an age of the internet, a time when we have airplanes and railroads and all that. This was a time when mostly everything was done by horse and buggy. So imagine how hard it was to travel at that time and how long it took. But this intelligent black man of that time was able to get one of the first, if not the first, U.S. passports issued to a black man. And again, you got to understand the context of it all. What was going on in 1815? There was a lot of stuff going on. So you had just came out of that revolutionary period. Someone like a George Barker, his father, his uncles, and the men of his family would have likely fought in the Revolutionary War. And the reason that we know that is because about 4% of those that fought in the Revolutionary War on the side of the United States, because remember, there were Native Black Americans that fought on both sides of the Revolutionary War. Some blacks fought on the side of the United States because, again, those like George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, they made certain promises to those black American soldiers. Oh, we're going to free you. We're going to abolish slavery for all the states. Because remember, they told those black soldiers that chose to fight on the side of the United States that they were going to free all of the blacks. So we forget that history, and it's sad that we do. So what happened, there were certain black men that didn't believe it. They said, I don't trust these American whites. I don't think they're going to abolish slavery in every state. So they actually ended up fighting on the side of the British. And for those that know their history, the British ended up they did free those blacks that fought with them. In fact, that's how you got a lot of the first, what was originally Native Black Americans that moved to Canada. Some moved to Britain, and some moved to the Caribbean nations that were actually controlled by the British. We've forgotten this history. There's a proclamation out there that you can go read called the Dunmore Proclamation. So you had Black Americans actually fighting each other in the Revolutionary War, which was George Barker's father's generation. So there were all these promises of freedom and abolishing slavery and reparations even back then. But I will leave that to each individual to decide, did the black man choose the right side? The blacks that fought with the British and got to move to Canada and got citizenship in Europe and the Caribbean, and a couple of them went to Africa as well, versus the blacks that 90% of them remained in slavery after the Revolutionary War, and only 10% were actually granted that freedom in the north, in those 10 northern states. But remember, 90% or so of the population of blacks at that time was in the South. So just keep that in mind. So that gives you a little bit of the context of who George Barker really was. Now and also, as you heard in the clip, that certificate was actually granted from the Department of State and the U.S. Navy at that time, because George Barker was actually a sailor. So keep that in mind too. George Barker, when he got issued that passport, he had just recently left the War of 1812. some of us have forgotten the importance of the War of 1812, because that's when the British came back to the United States and said, you know, hey, you guys beat us in that first battle, but we're coming back and we're going to try to see, can you do it a second time? So a lot of people actually refer to the War of 1812 as the Second War of Independence, because you had the Revolutionary War that was fought when the United States declared their independence, and then they went on to create the United States. But not too long after that, the British came back and tried to reclaim the United States. And some of the things that happened during that time. Now, remember, George Barker, he was a sailor in the U.S. Navy at this time. That's one of the reasons he was actually able to get that passport, because he had actually served the United States against the British in the Second War. So in the War of 1812, the United States took on the Great Britain, who was still the greatest naval power, even though they had lost the Revolutionary War. And so you had the British, the Canadians that were up there in Canada at that time, and even Native American tribes had joined with the British to try to fight the United States for control of this, what we call the United States today. So what happened is that group of allies on the British side, they were actually able to capture and burn the Washington, D.C. They burned Washington, D.C. down, including the White House, in August of 1814. So George Barker was there fighting in that war, protecting the United States, while they were burning down D.C. in August of 1814. So what happened is that, you know, eventually the United States was able to fight off the Canadians, the Native American tribes, and the British, and they signed what was called the Treaty of Ghent on February 17th, 1815. So they were actually able to win that war. But just think about that time period that I just told you, though. So they signed the treaty on February 17th, 1815, and within that same time frame, you had this brother who was from Massachusetts, who was 27 years old at the time, that was mobile enough, intelligent enough, and connected enough to be traveling around the United States and getting passports issued that same year. Now, remember, Washington, D.C. was burned down that year. They burned down the White House and burned down all kinds of buildings in D.C. But somehow this dude was connected enough that he was still able to get his passport at a time where they probably would have had a backlog of people trying to get, you know, certified at that time. So I just think it's important that we understand that there's faces and there's many people that have made a lot of sacrifices for us to have freedom of movement. And we should not take that for granted, especially when you look at some of the laws that were overturned during that time and who overturned them. Like in the example where I gave you of Massachusetts and how George Barker was born in 1788. It was only 5 years earlier that Massachusetts had begun that process of overturning their own slavery system in their state, because it began with a case called Commonwealth versus Jennison. We've forgotten a lot of this history. In the case of Commonwealth versus Jennison, it was a black slave named Quack Walker who sued the person that claimed to be his owner for his freedom, and he won. And so it was that Massachusetts Supreme Court case, Commonwealth versus Jennison, that put the pressure on the Massachusetts legislature to finally abolish slavery in their state. And again, there were people like Quack Walker, who would have been George Barker's father's generation, who said, it's no way that, you know, we had almost 10,000 black soldiers fighting and dying on the battlefields of Concord and Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia and all these places, and you're going to sit here and deny us our rights. So what they did, those like Quack Walker who were enslaved, they said that war has to mean something. Black soldier sacrifice has to mean something. Abolish this system. And they won in the courts. And then that's when you had George Barker's generation come up. So they were this post-revolutionary generation. So remember, 10,000 of your forefathers fought on the side of the Americans in that war. 10,000. Okay. They represented like 5% of that army. So this is the kind of spirit that George Barker was born into. And that's why I'm not surprised that he had the kind of strength that he did. And that's why he was walking around in 1815, applying for U.S. passports, moving from north to south. So I just want to read kind of some of the laws that they had in place at that time, so you can get an idea of how restricted black people's movement was. And again, I'm referring mostly to black men. Our movements were very important to be watched and monitored all throughout the United States. So they had all kind of laws in the books in those states at that time. And one of them read, it said, it was called An Act to Prevent Disorders in the Night. So it said, whereas great disorders, insolences, and burglaries are oftentimes raised and committed in the nighttime by Indians, Negroes, and mulatto servants and slaves, to the disquiet and hurt of Her Majesty, no Indian, Negro, or mulatto is to be outside from home after 9 o'clock. So here's just one of the laws they had. This was a regular law in one of these states that I was reading, because I was reading through like different laws that were restricting Black movement at that time. And this was just like a normal law that they had, that Black men specifically, you better not be out, you know, after 9 p.m. Even Negroes and Indians and mulattoes. So they applied that to all of them. They were very, you know, serious about restricting our movements. So it got me to thinking about like how large the Black population was at that time and who these free people were, because it's interesting that it was like when the year that he applied for his passport, there were a little bit over 200,000 free Negroes in America. That's incredible. That's incredible to me, that at a time when there were 1.2 million enslaved Blacks in the United States, there were over 200,000 free Negroes walking around the United States and applying for passports and moving freely to them, as long as they didn't get caught by any of these slave catchers and stealers of men and women. So the population was around 1.4 million in the what was at that time the third census of the United States. So they took the census in 1810. So that was the population. So the total population of the United States at that time was like 7.2 million, but the total what was called Native Black Americans, including the enslaved, was about 1.4. So George Barker was one of these free American Negroes walking around in 1815 at a time when only 200,000 or so of them were free to do so. So that population was around 17% Native Black Americans at that time. So yeah, that's part of the history of George Barker. And there was some more laws that kind of stood out to me in regards to this freedom papers thing, because they called them slave papers, freedom papers, passport papers at that time. And so it wasn't an easy thing to do when you think about it. Like, you have to be a fairly intelligent Black person to be able to get these kind of certifications and documentations at a time when there was so much resistance to you just overall. But communications were very slow back then. Transportation was very slow. But somehow you had these 200,000 Black Americans that were able to do these things. And I think that's kind of important, because we've been talking about disintegration and a splintering of Black America as well over the last few weeks. And I'm definitely going to be doing a panel to dig deeper in that. Hopefully, if not the end of next week, then it'll definitely be like the first week of March. But this whole break and this separation in Black America has actually always been there. It just wasn't as widespread as it is in 2020. And that's where I think a lot of the frustration and conflict is coming from, because there are actually people that have benefited from forcing certain Black individuals to live amongst other Black individuals. So for all those complaints about Jim Crow, the biggest beneficiary of Jim Crow was not the aspirational, ambitious Native Black American. The biggest beneficiary of that were the incompetent, the unproductive, and the degenerate Blacks. They benefited the most from Jim Crow because there was a buffer between them and the rest of society, because there was a time when during that period where these Blacks that were upwardly mobile, which we see today in what is called the four Black Americas, would separate themselves as soon as they got the chance. So if you look at a situation like, okay, when the American wall of apartheid for Jim Crow fell in 1965, most of those Blacks were forced to live in these segregated communities, even in the North. So yes, it's true that we always talk about the South and Jim Crow, but the North had their own Jim Crow as well. It was just done through restrictive covenants and redlining, right? So the moment that wall fell down in America, guess what? Those Black lawyers, Black doctors, Black teachers, accountant, and business people, they had like what they called Black flight to the suburbs, because they always had the money and they always had the the want and the will to live amongst themselves and create their own suburbs. And as soon as they took down that apartheid wall in America, most of those blacks went off and created their own suburbs. See, we don't talk about that enough. And that's why so much of what came afterward got exposed. All of that stuff was there before, you know what I'm saying? The black pathology was always there, but it just got exposed because of black flight that happened because of them being forced to live amongst people that they didn't want to. Can you guys just imagine being forced to live next to some of these people that you engage with, the toxic people that you just come in contact with in your real life, but especially in these spaces? Can you imagine being forced to live amongst these people? You see what I'm saying? Because I'm trying to point out to you that we actually went backwards, right? Because a lot of that Jim Crow segregation was a re-entrenchment. So there were periods during Reconstruction when blacks did a black flight too. We don't talk about it. But after the Civil War, there was a serious black flight. And even all during the slavery times, there were those 200,000 blacks in 1815 that were living separately, even during those times. Jim Crow went backwards. It forced people who had been living for generations freely to live amongst people that they didn't want to live next to, so that white immigrants and the white Confederates and their supporters in the North could take control of land and resources that blacks had taken for themselves. So it was a theft. That's what Jim Crow apartheid was. It was an affirmative action program for white immigrants and white men, and it was also a theft of property. You should read some of the stories that I've read about what happened to some of these people when they came back with Jim Crow after Reconstruction. They took land from people. They forced black business owners to give up their land. So let's say that you own a store during Reconstruction. Once they passed the Jim Crow laws, they said, well, you can't live in this space. Some of these counties and some of these states just took the property, and some gave them using eminent domain. They just gave them pennies on the dollar for it. There's a lot of theft that happened during that time to black people. So there was a retrenchment. We went backwards, and then we went forward again in 1965. And those same blacks that were forced to go and live amongst people that they did not share the same cultural outlook on, they did black flight again. But now what has happened, we've entered a new level of the shit now. See, the level that we're reaching now is going to be global. It's going to be global. That's what's going to happen now. So the new black flight is not going to be simply moving to the suburbs or whatever. The new black flight is going to be black of the 4 black Americas creating their own towns type thing. And there's going to also be a large expatriation of blacks at the end of this decade to start the next decade. Mark my words on it. So what we're going to see, now that the lines have been drawn so clearly in what the brother Mr. Eugene Robinson calls the 4 black Americas, those lines that have been drawn between the black transcendent, the mainstream middle class, the abandoned poor class, and what he calls the emergent class, which has 2 parts to it: the biracial mixed race people, and then the foreign immigrants. And remember, we just got news that Donald Trump just added more countries, more black and brown countries to his list of those on that travel ban. So think about that emergent group that Eugene Robinson points out. That emergent group is about to shrink, and they're going to have to figure out how they're going to work with Native Black Americans now. Because remember, there was a lot of disrespect from certain elements of the diasporas against Native Black America. Let's just be honest about that. And now they found themselves in a situation where, the disrespect, the underappreciation for the kind of sacrifices that those like George Barker have made over time to allow them to come to the United States and enjoy the privileges that they have. Now they're looking around for allies. And the Native Black American man and female is saying, you know what? Hey, we got a lot of problems to deal with right now. There's no reason for, America to be sending out $60 billion in foreign aid to all these different countries across the planet, because it's okay, so you have foreign aid welfare is taking about $40 to $60 billion annually from the poor people of the United States and giving it to rich people and government puppets in other countries. So you have a lot of Native Black Americans saying, nah, we need that $60 billion to go back to black issues. Because again, I just said to you about the black towns thing. I was looking at the numbers. So for the amount of foreign aid that goes out to places like Israel, Nigeria, Brazil, all these other countries that you're paying for, do you realize with that $60 billion per year, that you could create 207,000 single family homes every year, fully paid off without a mortgage, housing 830,000 Native Black Americans. Now, you guys in the chat, you tell me, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm divisive. Okay, maybe I'm divisive. But when I hear about the travel ban, I don't give a shit. I'm going to be honest with you. Because I just said to you, you got $60 billion of taxpayer money going to these foreign despots, the foreign rich, and it does nothing for the Native Black American. Then they tell us every day what they can't do for us, okay? Even though George Barker, Du Bois, and Carter G. Woodson have made all these sacrifices. You're not going to take from the plate of the native-born Black Americans whose families have made the greatest sacrifices, 25 generation, and make me get up and jump because you're sending money overseas. Again, I'm going to say that number again. And I want you to remember this number. The $60 billion in foreign aid that goes out to all these countries. You could house, no, I'm not talking about a mortgage. You could build from scratch on average just about 208,000 single family homes, housing nearly 831,000 native born Black Americans every year. Did you hear that, people? Not a mortgage. You would own these homes. Why aren't you fighting for these kind of things? You could be building your own Black suburbs and your own Black towns. So when Trump issued that travel ban, I didn't shed a tear, and I'm not going to shed a tear. Because if you say it's so great over there, then you should be happy that Trump passed that bill. We're going to see how great you really think it is. Because Native Black Americans got to get back to our own issues and fixing our own social problems. Because like even our enemies say that we have the most social problems. You know what? I'll give it to you. Native-born Black Americans, our culture is trash right now. We have the most problems to deal with, and that's what we're going to do. The next decade and the next generation, we're going to get to fixing our own cultural problems. You've been jumping on us saying that we got problems. You've been calling us a katas. The white society has issued benign neglect policy on Black Americans through the Democrats and the Republicans for the last 60 years. So we're going to fix our problem by setting a new standard for what it's going to mean to be a Native Black American, what it's going to mean politically, economically, and individually. But we're never going to walk away from the American creed of liberty, equality, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire economics because our grandparents shed the most blood for it and got the least. The whites that shed blood, they got the most. New immigrants got more than our great-grandfathers got from shedding blood for this country, okay? So when I was reading Donald Trump's travel ban, and I'm listening to like these tears coming from all these non-ADOS Black people, I just thought it was funny because these are the same people that come in these spaces and they on social media and talk so badly about Native Black Americans. And now that Native Black Americans are saying you got to give us that money for our vote, period. Our votes cost now, okay? Even someone like the trashy Bloomberg understands that you ain't getting nothing without dropping some money, period. Our votes count now. We don't want no promises no more, okay? All y'all do is break promises. Pay us for our vote, give us money to start businesses, or we not voting for you. Just that simple. So for those that don't know, the Supreme Court gave power to Trump to do the travel ban initially on like 6 countries. But what happened is that after he won the last case, they said that he has the power to ban anyone he wants now. And this is one of the reasons why I don't get caught up in this whole, oh, America's going to turn brown in 50 years. That's what y'all think. Look at the countries that he barred with his travel ban that was giving him a blank slate to do so from the Supreme Court. So he can ban anyone he wants now. Nigeria, Eritrea, Sudan, Tanzania, Kyrgyzstan, Myanmar, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, and Somalia. That's just what he has so far in his first term. He's already banned those people from those countries. And he himself he just cut $10 billion in foreign aid. Trump did. And I think the argument that Black Americans should be making to all politicians is cut it all and give it to Black Americans, period. Why are you taking taxpayer money from the poor of America and giving it to despots and kleptocrats outside of America, even though Trump himself said straight out, it does nothing for Americans to give all that foreign aid welfare to those countries. So there's going to be a major reduction in immigrants from other countries. And everyone's been using Native Black Americans as a step stool for their pursuit of power and their own self-interest. But it's funny. As soon as things go badly for all these other groups, and I'm talking about anyone that's not a Native Black American, because again, my roots go back to George Barker. My grandfather fought in the Korean War. I'm not giving up my right to individualism. I'm not giving up my right to be acknowledged and recognized in the U.S. Constitution. So when I say everybody, I mean literally everybody. This is a moment for Native Black Americans to close their ranks, to focus themselves on fixing this broken culture, and to demand that we get something in exchange for our vote, because that's what government's there to do, to decide on who's going to get what, where, and when. So once we need to figure out what we need, when we demand it, and how it's going to be dispersed. We don't want no loans that got to be paid back. We want cash. We want policies that can't be overturned by the next U.S. Congress elected 2 years later. We want policies that can meet the standard of the Supreme Court. We don't want no policy that the Supreme Court will overturn. Anything that they offering to you for your vote better be constitutionally strong, and it better be direct cash that closes the racial wealth gap and gives you what you deserve from all the sacrifice your grandparents have made. So yeah, people have told me in this space, you're decisive. You're divisive for saying these kind of things. No, I'm not. It's only divisive when Black Americans make demands for themselves. So when you see Black men running around saying free choice and free movement, people get triggered by that. Because again, they don't understand the historical context of the kind of sacrifices that the men like George Barker made, you know, and that's why it's easy to make that kind of claim. But that's really, you know, what I wanted to say about it. If someone wants to jump on for like another 60 minutes and add something to it, I'm okay with that. But before that happens, there was this one law that Virginia had around the time that George Barker was able to travel through the United States that I thought was interesting. I'm gonna try to bring it up real quick. Because there's just too much of this history that's been lost. And there are so many people that have so much to say about the Native Black American, and especially about the Black males embracing their freedom of choice, that we're gonna have to start giving a lot of historical context, I see, as we go forward. Because if you try to just have like a 2020 conversation, it's easy to justify certain things, but not when you start putting in a total historical framework of no group has been more restricted by the state, by cities and counties, and the federal government than the Black American male. And I refuse to join in anyone ever trying to restrict the Black man from this free movement. And we have to destroy those narratives, because narratives are very dangerous. Don't ever underestimate narratives. And the reason that I say this is because, you know, the Nazis and the Jews put out a lot of stuff over the last 70 years in regards to propaganda. And it's kind of fascinating to read about how the Jews thought everything was so sweet, even though they saw the Nazis being elected democratically and they heard the rhetoric, they didn't take it very seriously. And it was that rhetoric and not taking it seriously that ended up getting like 10 million of them baked in ovens. And they weren't the only ones. There were even Blacks in Germany that were killed too, because they were irresponsible and unaware of how serious to take the Nazis. We have a rise of a Black misandric Nazi group now. It's really true. The new Nazism is Black misandry. It really is. A hatred of Black men. That's the new Nazi, and we have to start calling it that. We have to start going at these narratives hard. I don't care where it comes from, other Black men, white people, Black women, I don't care. If the narrative is anti-Black male, the narrative has to be dismantled, not responded to, but dismantled logically. Okay? I was trying to find that specific law from Virginia at that time in 1815. But they got this, you know what? I'll just tell you guys where you can find these. If you ever want to read about the different laws, they have a database that has been put together called the HEIN Online. And this database has like a collection of all the laws that were written prior to the Civil War. And there's so many laws here that restrict like the movement of blacks, man. So many laws. So I'll just bring it up on the screen so you guys can see it. But it's just, I lost the place where it was at. But I'm just going to let you guys see the database so that, you know, you can go yourself and just, you know, browse the database, man. Learn some of your history. This is Black History Month. And Dr. Carter G. Woodson lobbied very hard for you to have this month of recognizing the achievements of Native Black Americans. And you do yourself a disservice by not at least taking some time to just learn some of the history, man. So on the screen, this is an entry in the hindonline.org. And they got like all the documents from like the Library of Congress. They're digitized now. And you can just go through and read them yourself, man. I shouldn't have to tell you to read this kind of stuff from time to time. But so this is like one of the laws from Virginia. And I'll just read the first paragraph just to show you that all this stuff is available. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that it shall be lawful when for the governor of this Commonwealth to hire the free Negro and slave convicts at any time in the penitentiary to the owners of coal pits to work in said pits in any county of the state, and the money arising therefrom to pay into the public treasury to the credit of the penitentiary. See that right there? That's why I wanted y'all to check out this database, because you find out none of this stuff is new. So when you talk about private prisons, they've been doing this private prison thing for a long time. So even the free Negro who found himself locked up was being leased out with the slaves and other prisoners to private corporations in Virginia around the time of the Civil War, and had been in place for a few decades. But these are the kind of laws that they actually had in place. So it's kind of fascinating just to read the actual law and to find out so much of what we're talking about now with like private prisons and the leasing of prisoners, paying them like a penny a day. This stuff is not new. And the thing about it, just like now, a lot of the same laws that they incarcerate people for, they just made up so that they can use these people for free labor. So, for example, like in Virginia, a freeborn person like George Barker, they just started passing laws saying, well, if you get behind on such and such fine, or you get evicted from your home, you got to go do like a year in prison. But it was to steal their labor without paying for it. So that's what that was about. So when we talk about George Barker and we're talking about passports and freedom papers, just remember that these freedom papers and certificates of freedom were the kind of documents declaring the free status of these blacks, because their freedoms and their movement was always under restrictions and threat at any time. So these kind of papers were important because these freeborn black people live with that constant fear of being kidnapped and sold into slavery. So the passports proved the free status of a person and served as legal affidavits to like the different sheriffs and deputies that wandered around and police that wandered around looking for black people to watch the movement. So that's why I'm so against anything that would restrict blacks movement. So if there's anyone that might want to have something to say, I pretty much just wanted to leave it there because, it's Black History Month, and I thought I would, just add something to the conversation historically when it comes to free movement, because this is a conversation I think is going to continue over the next year. And I mean, I love history, and I'm always going to be able to bring an argument from a historical context and being connected to current policies or whatever. So whoever wants to continue to talk against black male freedom of choice and freedom movement, you got a hell of a fight on your hand, because it's a battle that you will lose. You've been losing it. You're going to continue to lose it. And you put yourself in the camp of Black misandry, going against black men's freedom of movement. And that's why I thought George Barker. So for anyone in the chat, put a 1 if you knew who George Barker was, and that he was like, if not the first black person to ever receive a passport, but one of the very few first ones. Who in the chat knew who he was? If you knew he was, put a 1. Because I'm just curious, because I didn't even know who George Barker was until I actually started looking into this whole freedom of movement thing. So based on what I'm seeing with 100 people watching, not one person knew who he was. Okay, so one person said they knew who he was, Robert J. Carmichael. So Robert J. Carmichael, Leanne Bentley, that's 2. So with 100 people watching, 2 people of 100. So that's okay. Omega Dread said that he knew who George Barker was as well. That's shocking. So that's 3%. So 3% of the live audience knew who George Barker was in a space that's Black men talking about the 9 areas of human activity. So that tells you something right there. That was crazy seeing that document, man. His actual U.S. citizenship certificate, because the document that you guys saw in the intro, that document was issued after his passport. That's why his whole character and who he was is so fascinating to me, because he was 27 years old when he got his passport from the Secretary of State James Madison them through the custom house up there in Boston. But he was 33 years old when he was issued this U.S. citizenship certificate. So what does it tell us? So think about that. So he had been in the Navy. They had just finished the war of 1812 with Britain, where they signed the treaty. And immediately when he was released from the Navy, he was trying to, because remember, he lived in Massachusetts. But in order to travel in the southern slave states, those states required him to get this passport and to have certain papers. So one of the things that happened between 1815 and the 1820s is that the value of slave labor went up during that period. So the laws became even more restrictive just in the change of those 5 to 7 years. That's why he already had the passport, but he also had to get a U.S. citizenship certificate as well. So imagine at that time having to walk around with these different forms of paper just so that you can go visit a loved one in the South or family in the South, or just go, visit the South in general. So you are always under constant threat. So I just think that we should be cognizant of this history, man, and that we should be very careful to ever allow ego, clickbaiting, clout chasing to get us drawn into conversations that are very dangerous when you take a step back and consider who listens to our conversations. You see what I'm saying? They want to see you having these kind of dangerous conversations that if no one knew what your color was, they would think you were part of the Ku Klux Klan sometimes. And I want to separate myself from those kind of dialogues. I want to bring this kind of story. They don't want you to know about George Barker. They don't want you to know that George Barker was one of the first people to ever receive a passport. He was a Black man. And according to the discussions in this conference, I guess he would be called a non-select Black man. He was a non-select classic man because he was 5'2". And he was dark with kinky hair. And according to the Swirl Mountain Concubines and the Alpha Madden Kings, that would make him a non-select classic man because he was very dark skinned. They describe his skin in the certificate as sable skin. That's very dark brown, very dark black. So he was like one of these really indigo black guys walking around with an afro, and he was 5'2", but he was a sailor and he was well traveled. So that's something I take pride in, knowing that there have always been Black men like that always go against the grind, always willing to go against the crowd and go against that misandry. They didn't want him traveling around the South like that. So is there anyone in the chat that has something to say before I get off here? If you do, hit me with an email and I'll see if anyone wants to join that might have something to say before I get off here. Otherwise, I'm going to close it out. You can hit me up at this email and I can give you about 30 minutes to talk. But whatever the case, I just think it's important that we tell our stories, man. Wait, I put the wrong address. Don't use that address. That's the wrong one. Here's a full address. There you guys go. But it's important that we tell our own stories, man. We got to stop letting people hijack our history. We got to stop looking to other people to tell our stories. I don't want to hear that anymore. Like, it's a word that I've kind of eliminated. I've eliminated this idea of when, how people say things like, well, why didn't they do this Black movie? Or why didn't they tell this Black story? Or why didn't the politicians? I'm tired of hearing that at this point, man. Stop asking other people to do what you're supposed to do. Well, why didn't you start this business? We're beyond that now in 2020, man. We're really beyond it at this point. You got to get it done. I got to get it done. We got to get it done. Don't stop looking for other people to retain your stories. Stop looking for other people to respect your culture and retain your culture. It's on you. No one else cares anymore. We're moving into an isolated world on one level and a globalized world on one level, because it's interesting to watch that whole Brexit situation, right? So on one hand, it's the most globalized world ever because you could reach out from the United States to Europe, to China, to Latin America, you know, with just like a fingertip push, right? A button. But at the same time, you had like the European Union is breaking up right now because like without the Great Britain and the United Kingdom, they're pretty much saying that the Eurozone won't even exist in 10 years. So what you're going to have is that these countries are going to go back to more of an isolated nationalistic position over the course of this decade, because I'm hearing that Scotland, they're saying that they want their independence now from the UK, Great Britain, the French, the Germany, and all these other countries that are holding up the Eurozone are saying that they're going to leave as well. So the European Union will be finished by 2030. You might as well just go ahead and say that right now. It's pretty much a wrap for them, because basically it was an unbalanced situation where Great Britain and Germany were holding up the European Union from a financial situation anyways. And the German people are going to be like, we're not about to be carrying the Greece, France, and Italy and all these countries. So it won't be long before the Eurozone breaks up. Some are saying it'll be broken up by the end of this decade. I wouldn't be surprised it's broken up by 2025. So all these countries go back to a nationalistic position. They have their own currency and they're concerned about their domestic issues. So it's kind of odd that on one hand, we're able to connect globally because of the internet, but we're actually going in reverse where people are focused on their domestic issues and trying to take care of the people in their country. And in regards to the United States, the Native Black American has a lot of issues to deal with this decade. And one of them is stop letting your money go to other people, especially rich people in other countries. Those monies need to come back to Native Black Americans, period. Get them a tax cut or get them the cash back. That's what I think going forward. So I'm gonna read some of the comments. Bring up some of you guys' comments before I get up out of here. So yeah, man, if I don't get to you guys' comments when I'm talking, it's kind of hard to like talk and then read comments. So I just kind of look at them and browse through. But most of the time when I'm talking, it's kind of hard to follow some of the comments. So Solomon Giles says it's already happening. Denmark just voted a nationalistic conservative, and even Germany and Sweden are trending more nationalist because of all their immigration. Yeah, man, it's 100% right. That's the Brexit pretty much is the avatar for what's going to happen this decade. So things are about to change, man. And that's why you hear Donald Trump saying things like "Make America Great Again," Americans first, because that message resonates with a lot of people who've been left out of the loop because of all these foreign wars run by corporations with these fake politicians that they put in power and these globalist interests that have nothing to do with the rank and file people. And that's why they're jumping on with these populist movements. And it's going to just pick up over the next couple of years. So Naima Buckner says, so Kingston, would you say that these restrictions are forcing Black folks and the diaspora to work together? You know, that's a good question, Naima. I don't know. You know, it's too early to decide. I can't make the determination because he just passed it these last 12 months. So when you look at those countries of the list, he had Nigeria, Eritrea, Sudan, Tanzania, Kyrgyzstan, Myanmar, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, and Somalia. So I don't know, Naima. You tell me. Do you see the people from those countries working with Native Black Americans? And I'm not talking about talking. I'm talking about actually doing. So you tell me, Naima. I don't know. It's too early to tell because the travel ban is just got put in place on the first version like last year. And this new travel ban just kicked off like a month ago. So I don't know. Time will tell. We'll know by the end of this decade if we're all around still. Edward Bailey, if they want my vote, they need to pay me $3 million and 3,000 acres of land reparation-wise. Hey, you got to put a price on your vote. If that's your price, it is what it is. But it's definitely going to be a discussion on what Black people want from these politicians going forward. And I think that's why we continue to have these kind of discussions, because Black people are trying to figure out, you gave away your vote for 60 years and you don't got nothing to show for it. But cultural destruction, gentrification, and being erased from the national mainstream by an influx of over 16 million illegal immigrants in 2020. So that's where we're at. And I think that's what brothers are trying to figure out. What comes next and what we want, what we can do, what we can control and what we can't control. That's what these discussions are about. So Edward Anderson says that he won't do with the Zionists. I don't know what he was referring to with that one. Turbattle says Democratic Party keep drinking L's, a party of women. Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. They haven't presented anything to black men at all. Nothing. So I actually, and Edward Anderson, I see he's in the chat. We've had the discussion before, and I think he's 100% right that you'll have more black men sit out this election than since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I actually 100% agree with him on that. That's really going to be the story of 2020, I believe, at this point. Because again, we're already in February. So we have the Nevada caucus, that's on Saturday. And then you have the South Carolina primary on the 29th. So you have the first 4 primaries and caucuses completed. And then you have Super Tuesday, March 3rd. And I think that as things approach the convention in July, it's going to become very clear that the story is going to be the amount of black men specifically that didn't vote for anybody, that just stayed home. So that's starting to become the story, So I have to agree with Edward Anderson on that one. He's probably going to be 100% proven right that the biggest story is that you're probably going to have the lowest number of black men to not vote and protest vote since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Hey, peace to you, Rollo, man. Let me see. So that is interesting that we had, out of 100 people watching, we only had 3 people that had ever heard of George Barker, even though we've been talking about this passport bro, SYSBM, freedom of movement, freedom of choice conversation since at least August, but only 3 people out of 100 knew who he was. Solomon Giles says that's exactly what the people of color term does, allows black Americans to yet again be used as a stepping stool. Absolutely. I'm 100% against that people of color, term that was created by the intersectionalists, and it was created to wash out Native Black Americans. So that's why, regardless of where you stand in terms of this ADOS, this FBA, Native Black Americans, wherever you stand on those terms, the Native Black population to this country has a unique history and a unique struggle and has made unique sacrifices, and no one's going to wipe us out. No one's going to erase us. In fact, the more they try to, the more that it really shows you who really doesn't give a shit about you. Because I don't care what your political views, there's no reason why you would want to have your history washed away and erased. So I have lots of differences with people from, politically, but when it comes to recognizing our lineage group and protecting that history and what it's meant to this country, no one's going to wash it out. I'm not going to let anyone wash it out. So that's something I do have in common with the Black nationalists, that we have a particular racial lineage, and that's all we have to hold on to in this country, at least. And it's not fair for people to take advantage of all those sacrifices and they get all the benefits and the majority of blacks get none of them. So if there's going to be any benefits handed out, then they should go to those people that made those sacrifices children. Just simple as that for me. It's real simple. Rael says Israel holds a strategic position for U.S. interest in that region. They ain't just giving money just because. Yeah, I mean, that's something that Trump doesn't really like to talk about. He dismisses it. He says that all the foreign aid welfare is a waste of money. That's why he cut 10 billion in this budget. In the 2021 budget, it's the smallest foreign aid welfare budget over the last 30 years. So Trump cut out 10 billion. Obviously, he cut most of it from those 8 countries that he issued the travel ban from, because I believe that in Africa, Nigeria was the biggest recipient of foreign aid welfare for that continent. Of the 54 nations of the continent of Africa, I believe Nigeria and Ethiopia were the number 2 largest recipients, Israel being number 1 globally. And so he cut 10 billion, and most likely the 10 billion came from the cuts from those 10 countries or so that he put on a travel ban. But he said straight out that the foreign aid welfare doesn't benefit U.S. taxpayers. So you can't take that away from me. He did say that. Edward Bailey says it's not a culture, it is black pathology and black dysfunction. Yes, that has come to define the black majority. Yes, that has become what black culture is, what we call black redneck culture. And that's unfortunate. Let me see. Scud Missile says black people have to be the majority. I don't even know what that means, because in terms of being the majority, I don't know when black Americans were the majority since the 13 colonies. Maybe like back in the 1700s, but blacks haven't, ever since they started doing the first U.S. census. I believe the first U.S. census was like 1790, I think. We've been at around 16 to 18%, and now we're actually less than we were then. I actually was asking the question on my last live stream. They say that black Americans, Native black Americans, are 12% of the population. I don't believe that number. I think we're much less. Because if you take out biracials and you take out the African and Caribbean born blacks, I just don't believe that we're 12% of the population. I really think that we're more like 8 or 9% of the population. When you take out biracials, who are going to be in the 2030 census, their own category, 100%. And then foreign-born African and Caribbean people, they're going to be a different category on the census, if not on this census. Because I heard that Trump was putting that on this U.S. census. The distinction between Native black Americans and Caribbean and African-born black Americans. Trump was trying to put that on this census, and also with illegal immigrants. So I don't know if he got to put that on there or not, but I know for sure on the 2030 census, it's going to be way more distinctions, especially with black people. So I don't really believe that black Americans are 12% of the population. What do you all think? Do you think that Native black Americans are really 12%, or are we lower than that? Because I think we're lower. Shout out to the brother Dalawasha, man. Appreciate your support. I don't think that we're 12%, man. I really think our numbers are like 8%. So some people say it's much less. So there's a lot of people that agree with me that it's much less than that we've been told. And I think we need to take note of that. And so Omega Drez mentions the abortion thing. Yeah, you know, I talked about that report that came out last year from the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's been a lot of people that's been pretty silent on that. They don't really want to talk about those 21 abortions since 1973 by Native black American women. And that's why the black population numbers are slow. They are so low because 21 million abortions, man. Come on. Our population, even if we take that 12% number, would be around 20% today if you added in those aborted black fetuses. That's what it would be. Around 20 million today. But it is what it is. Hey, that's the deal that was made back in the 70s. I talked about the fact that Barbara Smith came up with this idea with the feminists and the black lesbians of the 70s. This idea of what they call identity politics. And to be honest, I did not know this whole time that identity politics was actually a contractual agreement that the leadership of the American black female population came up with to separate themselves from black men. Like they really, so the sexual contract was one level in 1988, but ever since back in the 70s, these black girl magic feminists literally had created like a contract between themselves and white liberals where they would be their own group, and it was called identity politics. Now, for the uninitiated like myself, we just thought that identity politics meant based on race, gender, religion, and all that, but that's not what it meant at all. It actually meant black woman. So I have to give them credit for their marketing. The black girl magic feminists fooled 3 generations of black men. They fooled us. But now we're going to have a deeper conversation over the course of the year. They called it identity politics to make it sound general and vague because they didn't have the courage to call it what it was. Black woman first. This is from the mouths of Barbara Smith herself, who coined the term identity politics. She had all of us thinking that it included us black men and other people and other religions. No, it was a declaration of independence by the American black woman from black men. And if you don't believe me, go look up Barbara Smith, who coined the term identity politics. It was great marketing. Kind of like how Barack Obama was a genius at marketing with that hope and change thing. Sometimes you come up with an idea that just sounds really good. But when you look at the details, it don't got nothing to do with no hope and change. It don't got nothing to do with everyone else's identity. And that's straight from the mouth of Barbara Smith, a 1970 feminist who just now endorsed Bernie Sanders. She's making her way around the media right now. And she said it. She said she don't have a clue what y'all talking about. She said identity politics ain't got nothing to do with black men or black children. It was about black females. It was she started the Black Woman First movement back in the 70s. I didn't even know who she was until she endorsed Bernie Sanders. Shout out to the brother Mike V, because he sent me a YouTube clip and I watched it. I see Rael, he's posting it right now. And I watched the whole thing. And I'm thankful for Barbara Smith for finally coming out of the shadows, because she had been in the shadows for 40 years. Now we know where the identity politics came from, and now we know what their mission statement was. They have been writing policy for Black America for the last 40 years. She said it herself. And you've been wondering where all this money going to that's supposed to be going to Black American families. It's been going to these nonprofit organizations run by Black feminists and Black lesbians. She said it herself. So you guys go ahead and check that link that Rael put in the chat, and you can get the full story on this identity politics, because those Black women misleading the majority of Black women declared their independence from the Black man and the Black family back in 1977. That was the exact year, 1977. And this woman hadn't even been known to the rest of us. But that's where all your money's been going to, creating a Black woman first movement. Now, we were always using the term Black woman first, but I hadn't heard no one talk about the actual historical context of what we were saying, and why we were all trying to figure out where all these messengers coming from. They were always there. They were getting the jobs through gender affirmative action at the universities. They were getting preferential treatment in corporate America. They were getting all those federal grants that were supposed to go to Black homes, building Black homes, to building Black schools, to building schools with computer technology. No, all of that money went to paying these high salaries to Black lesbians and Black feminists from 1977 to about 2010. And I say since 2020 because now that we're having these conversations, the question becomes, are you a free Black man or are you not? Because your policy has been written for the last 40 years by Black misandries. And now we know what the source is. Now it's important that we go through this literature that came out of people's minds like Barbara Smith, controlled by the dominant society. And we have to ask ourselves, if you're saying that if you're for restricting the movement of Black American men, then you are a misandrist. You are an acolyte of those like Barbara Smith. I say that the Black man is a free agent. The Black woman declared herself a free agent in 1977, and we need to accept the new conditions as they are and move forward with doing what's necessary to solve the problems of the individual, and then creating collectivist-minded people policies for those that want to be a part of that. But we're at the doing stage now. So we're definitely going to go over some of that literature. We already went over the sexual contract from 1988, Dr. Carol Petman, that started the third wave feminism. But we got to go back to that second wave. We got to go back to some of this literature from the 70s, and we're going to dig through it. But yeah, man, these women, these Black girl magic feminists, they took the mantle of what it was, Black agenda, Black leadership. They just took it and said, we're leading the Black community. We speak for the Black community, not just the Black woman, but they said they were speaking for you too. So we're going to revisit that. But my next book that I'm reading is going to be Daughters of the Trade. I'm going to pick that up. It's supposed to arrive today or tomorrow. So I'll have the Daughters of the Trade in my hand, in my possession over the next couple days. So I'm going to start reading that next week, but I can't wait to get through that. But after that, I'm going to have to dig more into this whole thing about the origins of the Black woman first movement. So that'll be some good discussions. So Dr. Phoenix says, that is where most Black feminist academics are coming from. Man, Dr. Phoenix, I didn't know it to the extent, man. I just, I didn't understand that they actually declared their independence from Black men in the way that they did. I didn't know that there was this whole body of literature. I never took like a gender studies class before. I never really read no feminist literature until I started reading like the sexual contract. And that was in the 80s. But a lot of this 1970s kind of literature, I didn't know about. I mean, these women actually said they declared their independence from Black men, but they hid it in the way that they described their movement. They called it identity politics, but it wasn't no identity politics. It was black female first identity politics, but that would have never been able to be sold to black men from 1977 to today if they had called it what it actually was. So Rael mentions, so for you people that's probably looking for something to read, Rael put up these names of these feminists from that era: Bell Hooks, Nikki Giovanni, Alice Walker, Audre Lorde, just a few names of these old feminists who ushered in a lot of this goofy shit. Yeah, and then add Barbara Smith, the creator of identity politics. And this is what they feared, see? They feared that the year of an election, black men would start to investigate some of these movements that occurred with the boomers. All of the women that he mentioned are boomers, because Barbara Smith's a boomer. She's 78 years old, the woman that coined identity politics. So there were a lot of anti-black male women from that boomer generation, man. They really hated black men, which is so crazy to me because they were coming out of an era of Jim Crow apartheid. And they say that, so while the white society did all these things to black people in general, somehow black men have been blamed for everything. So you had a lot of these hateful women coming out of these that boomer generation, man. I don't know all of the people that Rael put up, but I'm almost certain that they're all boomer women, just like Barbara Smith. God created black. I took the class, just didn't interest me, open my door. Okay. So we're going to investigate that. I think that's going to be an important thing that we talk about over the course of 2020, especially before the election. Start to look at some of these people that Rael mentions literature, because they didn't just disappear. There's this idea that there was like this 1960s to 70s movement and all these people just disappeared. No, they got jobs in academia. Nikki Giovanni, Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Barbara Smith, and people like that. They actually got good jobs in corporate America with think tanks, government jobs, and they've been shaping the conversation and the narrative and directing funds to their own organizations for 40 years. And that light needs to be shown on that. And it needs to be shown by the younger black men now. Hey, salute to Big Poke Dog, man. He says, salute King Sigma. Appreciate you, bro. We're going to dig into that stuff, boy. So I got to start with Daughters of the Trade, which is probably a fitting start. And I got to shout out BGS Idmore for that, because he was the first person that I ever heard mention the Daughters of the Trade. I never knew anything about the book until he mentioned it. So I put it on my list a year ago, but it took me a year to finally get to it. So that will be the next book that I read. And I think that'll be a fitting start, because with my surviving bottom shelf Brad conversations, and then mixing it in with this feminism, Black Woman First Declaration of Independence from the 70s, this will be a fun year for me in terms of developing my narratives and sharing it with you all and getting your feedback. So I'm gonna get one more comment before I go. I just saw one that I wanted to address before I got off here. So SKC says, just checking in, King. A lot of those women are in that PDF I sent you about how black male scholars and writers were suppressed by black women. Oh, I can't wait to read that, SKC. I haven't had a chance to get to it yet, but I will get to it over the next few days. I've just been kind of, a little backlog going right now and things to read. I saw something that NYC Songman had said. I wanted to address that before I got. Okay, so NYC Songman said, math knows no gender or ethnicity. Why are we U.S. black men still washing out of it? I mean, NY Songman, you already know the answer to that question, bro. You're a boomer. So he says, why are we washing? You know why we're washing out of it. Why is it that 7 out of 10 18-year-old black children are reading at a 4th grade level? You're talking about math. Did y'all hear that, people? NYC is talking about math, and we're not even teaching black children to read at above a 4th grade level at the age 18 when they reach 18. You can't even get to the math part because they can't even get the reading comprehension part right. They damn sure not going to embrace analytics and math. And come on, man. You know the answer to your question, NYC. You don't get an exemption because you're a boomer. So you have a better view of history than we do. You've been able to watch over the course of your life the breakdown of the black family and the horrible outcomes for the black majority, and especially black children. So that must have been a rhetorical question, because you said, why aren't these black children being taught math? You already know the answer to that question. Ask their father and their mothers. That's who you need to ask that to. Ask their fathers, and then ask their mothers, who are mostly raising them, at a clip of six out of 10 black women are raising 8 out of 10 black children. So you got to go ask them that question, NYC Sawman. Have you gone to those female spaces and asked them, why aren't you educating these black children in mathematics and reading comprehension? I have. They don't have an answer. As soon as I ask them that question, they start reverting to, it takes a village to raise a child. It doesn't matter who they laid up with and had the kid with. It doesn't matter who shut up the club. All that matters is that they're going to draft their personal problems onto you. So that's my only answer I can give you, brother. So if you want to know why they're not learning mathematics, you're going to have to go talk to the schools, the superintendents, and their parents. My mom made sure that if she couldn't teach me something, she got me in the Urban League. The Urban League used to have a program that I used to go to when I was struggling in school in my, when was it, like the 5th grade? I had a bad year that year. And my mom made me go to the Urban League until I got my grades up. So that was her. She didn't like doing, she didn't want to do the work, but she sent me to the right place to get it done. And when they couldn't get it done, she never dealt with no loser ass guys when I was growing up. So my mom, as I've told you before, her last husband just died. So over the course of my entire life, my mom never had a problem finding a competent, productive man to marry, even though I called her Black Widow, because all her husbands died except for 2. So for me, it's about the parenting. What the parents can't do, they have to go find the resource to get it done. And my mom didn't have the benefit of all the opportunities that we have now through like these online learning opportunities, but she did the best that she could as a working class woman. So if she could do it, come on. So that's the answer to your question, NYC. You need to go talk to these schools and these parents, man. Edward said that look at what Edward said, man. Come on, man. This dude's hilarious, man. He said, I say your village is all them Negroes that you fucked. For real. Seriously. That is the truth, though. I mean, it's funny, but that's the truth. That's your village. The cock carousel is your village. And until you figure out how you're going to value yourself, when the American black woman begins to value her womb the way that she should, a lot of these problems will get solved, man. It's just, I'm sorry to say it, but it will. Go on, Postal 28, salute. Salute to you too, man. Appreciate you, bro. He said your village is those deep. You know that Edward Addison is a marketer, man, because this dude be having these sayings. And Edward, I wanted you to email me that exact saying where you say, don't go red pill for non-ADOS women, but don't go blue pill for non-ADOS women and just be red pill for the ABW. Send me like the full quotation of that, because I got this little graphic software, and I want to put your quote on a graphic and put it in my community section, because I think something that you said and what Super Triz said was some of the good advice over the last 12 months, where you said that, and then Super Triz said something about stop following women on social media that don't follow you back. I think those are like some real good common sense quotes that should be shared and logged in. And I want to put it on a graphic. So you make sure you email me that exact quote, because I don't want to misquote you. And I'm going to put it on a graphic and put it in my community tab. So NYC says the girls have overtaken the boys globally in math now. So much for the BJ and sandwich ethos. US black men, wait the fuck up. I mean, the globally doesn't really tell the true story, because you're combining all the people on the planet. But I'm more focused on the United States perspective. That's not true for the United States. And then you have to break it down by socioeconomic class, where they fall in the for Black Americans, all that stuff. Because when you look at standardized tests, Native Black American men score on all the college testing, they still score higher than the females. All the grad school tests, everything. I've looked at the numbers for the GMAT, the LSAT, the GRE, the ACT, the SAT. Black men still score higher. And that's incredible to me when you think about how many obstacles are in our place and how poor many environments these black men are coming from. But we're still able to score higher. And again, that's like expecting someone to win a race that hasn't slept in like 2 days, hasn't been fed in 2 days, and is dehydrated, and then say, go out there and run the Olympics. That's what we gotta continue that conversation. That's because that's what's being done to these black boys. They're being told, go out there and run the Olympics. You can't eat for the next 48 hours. You can't drink any water for the next 48 hours. Just go run. While this other person's over here shooting up HGHG, they eating steaks with all the perfect. It's like that movie Rocky. Remember the one with the Soviet guy, where Rocky beat the Soviet guy that killed Apollo Creed, and how the Russians had all this technology that they had them like running on these machines, and they was feeding them horse tranquilizers. He was like built by technology. That's almost the kind of race that the black boy is being told to run. You're running a race against enhanced humans, but you're told you're not going to get no nutrition or support. This shit got to end, man. Or the abandoned poor class is going to be washed away in the next 10, 20 years completely. So I saw that the brother, shout out to Man of Tomorrow. He been going real hard the last week or two. He says, don't go red pill for black women, only to go blue pill for non-black women. Yeah. But Edward, you just send me that quote, man, because I'm going to put that on the graphic. I just like that quote, man. Because that's one of the things that, the free moving brothers talk about is that, it's really about you. It's about valuing yourself as a man, putting yourself first, and also creating a quality life. That's it. Putting yourself first and creating a quality life. It's not about pedestalizing the community. It's not about pedestalizing pussy or none of that stuff. It's about pedestalizing yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it with that and wrap this up. I appreciate you all coming through. Hopefully you enjoyed the dialogue. I mean, even just researching it for myself, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed learning about George Barker. So again, if not the first person to receive a passport, he was definitely one of the first couple. He was a black, dark-skinned, kinky-haired, woolly 5'2" black man born free in Massachusetts in 1788, and he got that passport in 1815. So if freedom of movement was good enough for the brother George Barker, it's damn sure good enough for me and the rest of you. So with that, peace.